Welcome to a special edition of the Learn with Lowell show. Today we're excited to welcome Mathilde Do Chi, an expert in the field of food law, alternative proteins. Mathilde has been instrumental in helping startups navigate the complex legal landscape of the food industry with a focus on emerging alternative protein space. Now, food law may sound boring, but it impacts our lives. There used to be a time where people used to sell snake oil or things that were called orange juice, and it was not orange juice, and snake oil didn't do anything for you. So we talk about the emerging alternative protein space, the legal challenges, the hurdles, EU food law versus other countries. This is actually a really fascinating episode. If you're interested in this type of thing, interested in discovering something that you didn't even know was fascinating, then please subscribe. We're putting out new episodes every week. So let's stay curious, learn about Mathilde, the alternative protein space, in this episode of Learn with Lowell show. What is unique about the EU regulatory landscape when it comes to like food tech that you found in your time being in that space?
So the EU has the strictest food system in the world. And the nice thing about the EU is like once you get approval in one country, so your product will be commercialized in the 26 other member states. So in total, it's 27. You just need to redo the labels because we have 24 official languages in the EU. And then you have also a system. The food system in Europe is built in a way that it's harmonized. So you just have to ask the approval to the European Commission, and then the member state, they have to follow what the European Commission said. And apart from this, it's also free movement of goods. So you don't have customs duties, taxes, and so on. And overall, the system is functioning pretty well. And when you have also sometimes food safety crisis, everything is tackled very fast because you have a system in place that might be more difficult to manage in other places of the world. Even sometime in the US, because I know sometimes that the federal authorities, they are not responsible, and it's up to the states to manage this whole situation. And I think sometimes when you have a lack of cooperation or the split of tasks or competencies that are not clear, it can hinder the speed, like how fast the problem can be tackled.
Mm-hmm. How does the landscape change at all as like some members choose to leave? I know I think there's like Britain's kind of leaving, and I think France is leaving. So then do they maintain that regulation so that it's easier for people to keep moving, or they have to like like how does that work? Is there any like weirdness with that?
So as far as I'm concerned, France is not leaving the EU for now. But Great Britain did with Brexit. And the thing is, when a member state decides to leave the EU, the member state has two choices. Either they keep the same regulations in place and they decide later on to update them or to rewrite them in a way that is more suitable for their needs. Or in the case of Brexit, Great Britain, they didn't plan rules applicable to the topic, like for food, transportation, and so on. So they had to figure out as soon as they left. So this is what is happening. For food tech, at the moment, they have the same rules in place than the rest of the EU member states, but they are planning to change it. But it's also a problem because now it's not harmonized. And I feel like British companies, they may suffer from these changes because they never know when it's going to happen. And if it's too different, they won't have also clarity in terms of whether or not they need to change their production process and so on to have them approved in other countries, because the British market is a small one in comparison to the EU.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the regulatory hurdles with, people leave, maybe not necessarily people leaving or staying, but just in the EU, do you think it's the right level for food, or do you think it's like too hard?
I feel that from the outside, it can appear to be a little bit too harsh, but I disagree with that because the level of safety is very high. In the sense that crises, they don't happen that often in comparison to other places. And the attitudes, I mean, is very different from the US. Like in the US, the motto is more ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Wherever in Europe, it's more paternalistic system where you have to ask permission before doing anything. And just once again, the fact that it's a harmonized system, you have to have strict rules in place just to signal to companies that they have to follow the centralized system. Otherwise, and in that case, don't have a lot of room for maneuver to do otherwise in other places. Like, for instance, with regard to cell meat in the EU, you have several states that are really in favor of this, whereas some others they are a bit reluctant to accept such changes. So the Netherlands will be very happy to have cell meats be put on the market very fast, but it's not going to happen because the final say is up to the European Commission. So it really depends, but I believe that more safety is better, but I also understand from a commercial point of view, it's frustrating. And you see some companies fleeing to the US because the system is more more welcoming towards innovation. And they see that their R&D is compensated faster because they will be able to sell it sooner.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And so sometimes I've heard, well, there's one example I've heard where people specifically pick the EU market as for the labeling, like, hey, we got it in the EU, we can use it in America. It's like, hey, they're so hard, it'll sell here. I'm specifically thinking of like Theranos. They wanted like Germany to get their labeling on their testing as a way to be like, hey, look, Germany likes us. Don't you guys want to like approve us for the military? Do people do that in food tech at all? Like use the EU's labeling, like, hey, we're approved here, it's like a badge?
I think it's possible, but I've seen the other scenario happening more often, that European companies, they are frustrated that it's taking so long and they prefer other markets like the US. But I do understand that having your product approved in the market that is the strictest is also like kind of like badge of honor. And it can be relevant when you decide to export to places that don't have a food system, like a legal system that is tackling foods. Like you have some countries that don't have any food regulations, and usually they accept products that have been checked by foreign authorities, and the EU has more weight than something that was approved, for instance, in Brazil.
That's interesting. And I think you wanted to, just before we like move on to a different topic, I think you wanted to mention a story about Impossible Foods in relation to the European market.
Yeah, sure. So it's about the HYME, soy hemoglobin. So the thing that is making the burger bleed like blood. And the thing is, it's made from genetically microorganism, and so it's GMO. And Impossible Food, they didn't have a lot of trouble to have it approved in the US, so through the GRAS system, which is actually a notification system. So you make your own analysis, you provide a lot of data, and you say to the FDA, according to our knowledge and the analysis that we conducted, we deem that our product is safe. Do you agree? And if the FDA doesn't have any concern, they will render no questions letter. Whereas in the EU, you can have such products approved either through a novel food application, so a product that has never been eaten before, at least in Europe, or you have to have it approved through a GMO regulation that is taking 5 years instead, 5 years to get an answer, in comparison to the novel food system. You have to wait on the average 2 years and a half to get an answer. And at the time being, I think they've filed for approval like 3 years ago, and it's still pending. And they just assume that since it was working in the US, it would be the same. It may be easier in Europe, but it was not the case. So I know a public affair consultancy that they approached and told them that they should change their strategy, but they refused and they went for another one that was willing to take the risk and told them to try. And in the end, it fired back at them. So
Will they ever get through it, or are they like do they not meet the metrics, like the standards to be in the EU, or is it just like taking longer? Like what's like the hurdle?
no, it's just taking longer, and most of the time it's in terms of
Mm,
that you have to prove that your food is safe.
okay.
And if you don't have enough data, then the European Commission gives 6 months more to you as an applicant to gather the information. And I think they just assume that it would be fast and easy, but in reality, it just turned out otherwise.
Mm. Were there other companies that did have it fast and easy that they were like, oh, okay, they were able to do it, so they were able to do it, or were they like, there's no reason that they should believe that it was going to be easy for them?
No, I think they were poorly advised.
Mm,
And I've worked in the food industry for almost 3 years now, and I've seen that the American companies, they have this attitude that as long as it's fine in the US, it might be in other places. So they are just willing to take some risk, but it doesn't work this way. So yeah, I don't know. I feel it's sometimes they minimize the risk too much, and you also have like everything related to alternative protein. I believe that there is too much hype, and people that are a little bit over enthusiastic, and they just assume that as experts, since they know so much, and especially VCs, because they are in touch with a lot of food startups and other companies, that they have been they have had the opportunity to discuss with funders over and over again, and they just assume that everybody is doing the same. But you have companies that outperform the others, and some others that are just lagging behind. And this is this has reached a point, as you may have heard, that plant-based meal sales have decreased this year because the market is oversaturated.
mm,
Companies, most of them, they didn't envision that having a plant-based product wasn't enough anymore, and they had to innovate and be able to deliver cleaner ingredients, products in general, like having plant-based meat that doesn't contain methyl cellulose, which is actually wood fiber. It's an additive. It's allowed both in the US and the EU, but people are a bit wary about wary of the consequences that if it's everywhere, like what kind of health issue you may develop as a consumer.
mm. I think in the this might have been like one of those wives' tales that's told, like when people in the US, there's like these stories of people putting like drugs or blades in like Christmas candy or something, no, Halloween candy, which is not actually true. That's never happened, but it just sounds so good that you like it keeps being told. But I heard that Parmesan cheese in the US used to have sawdust in it. And
Mm-hmm.
they were like, well, it tastes like Parmesan cheese. It's like, I think like, like you're saying, like maybe the bar should be higher. Like, the quality of ingredients should reflect like the taste as well. Cause I mean, if the taste is all you care about, like that's kind of concerning. Like you'd want, I don't think how many people would enjoy eating sawdust or, like cellulose type stuff, that we're talking about. If like you're imagining you're biting into a piece of meat and, the substrate material, like, isn't the same thing. It's kind of weird. Like I don't think there's even like the research behind it would be different as well. I imagine like the
Mm-hmm.
studies for how that affects people. Like I don't think anyone's ever done like, hey, if you eat a bunch of sawdust for a very long period of time, like what would that do to people?
Mm-hmm.
But
And yeah, I agree. And the thing is, like these foods, like that type of additives, they have not been on the market for a long time. So we just don't have enough data, and also we I mean, it's difficult to assess what is the true impact in the way that maybe you don't have studies conducted, or if someone is having a diet entirely composed of this, like do this person did this person have some type of, I don't know, diabetes issue because they had a very high consumption of this, or it's just so new that it's not because it's approved that it's 100% safe, and also 100% safe doesn't exist. You can still get, for instance, food poisoning from plant-based food. I actually food poisoned myself a couple of years ago making a green smoothie because the type of greens that I used, you are supposed to cook it, and I didn't know, so I blended them raw, and I was sick the day after. It's just about as well like poor nutrition education. I don't know, like I grew up in France, but I don't know in the US. But apart from eat your vegetables and fruit 5 times a day, that's the only thing that I can recall. We weren't really taught about what is the impact of eating too much dairy if you are lactose intolerant. Or now the big problem might be gluten, that you have more and more people that are allergic or intolerant to it. So it's just, I guess, a matter of like your food education highly depends on your environment, so your family, the school, and also if you are interested in learning about it yourself. And it's something that maybe students, once they go to university, they are willing to dive in. But as a kid, that's not something that is highly discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was a kid, they had the food pyramid, which is like the grains, then stuff were on top of it. But I think now it's like a food spectrum where it's like a pyramid with a bunch of waves. I think it's changed. Is all my point there is. And I mean, even in the course, I assume you're about my age. I assume over the course of our lifetime, we've become more aware of like how processed sugar messes with people, and I think we're aware of it, but like as like societally, I think like I don't see much of a trend changing too much, like in terms of what we need to do to like affect it. But when it comes to like the like having data for proving that it's safe in the U.S., there's like this weird thing I was reading about where like when you give the regulatory agencies the data, you just can give them like cherry pick data in the sense of like you don't have to give like if we ran a study for like 6 months and we had like the corpus of information that we gathered from it, you don't have to give them that. You just have to give them like the findings and like the data, which is like somewhat problematic because you could find a bunch of reasons why you'd want to like if you were getting results that were saying, hey, this is really healthy for kids 8 and under, and you started like cherry picking the people who didn't have a problem with it to keep with the study or like remove to not remove that data and remove the other data. You can like really bias what the data comes out, and then in itself, like then the statistics from that, it's even more biased. You can do stuff with that. But for the EU, do you have to give like if I'm a startup looking to do this stuff and I'm gonna go through this giant gamut, do you have to give like all the data, or because that I would like that I only ask because the US is such a lower bar from that. So I was just imagining like what are some of the specifics that are different for the EU. And is that like that's just like one question of an example of do you have to give like what type of data do you have to give, and do you have to give all of it, or can you select down and stuff like that?
So in terms of how much information you have to give in comparison to the US, it's a little bit higher. And when you decide not to provide data on a specific topic, you have to justify why. And if you can demonstrate safety through literature, for instance, or if you have a university that conducted a specific study, that by analysis you prove that you, as a company, putting money to demonstrate the same result is not needed. And in the US, it's a notification system. So you do your own analysis as a company, you draw your own conclusion. And even if the FDA think that your product might not be safe, you can still put it on the market. Whereas in the EU, you cannot do this. If the European Commission said no, there is no way that you can bypass this decision. And in the US, for instance, Perfect Day, that is making animal-free milk. So fermentation derived milk. So they do a biopsy and then they ferment the cell that normally give you the milk. They actually put it on the market before it was assessed by the FDA. And Impossible Food, they also failed several times to get a no questions letter from the FDA. But meanwhile, when they were figuring out how to modify the product in a way that would have the approval from the FDA, the product was still on the market. It's just it's a matter of how the system is constructed, and you have other countries like, for instance, Canada has the system similar to the EU in the sense that you have to get approval before putting the product on the market. Same for Singapore. And in the Middle East, it's a little bit different because this part of the world imports a lot of food, and they tend to accept products if they have been assessed by foreign authorities. So, but they may also require extra data or to connect their own analysis. And the thing is, since this type of foods they are so new, I'm a bit skeptical that you have actually the experts in governmental bodies. Like for instance, the Codex Alimentarius. So it's the UN agency. It's from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO, and the WHO, World Health Organization, that has a specific organization that is setting up food standards, food safety standards. And at the time being, you don't have any standards for novel food yet. And I think it was mid-2022 that a delegation, so the Codex Alimentarius Commission, they went to Israel to learn more about the technology and what type of food safety issues that you have to consider for this product. Because, for instance, for cell-based meat, I think most of the safety hazards, they are related to what type of problems the meat industry has to be aware when they produce this type of food. And if you can apply the same reasoning, for instance, like when you export meat, or even if you sell it like within the same country, you will usually need a lot of documents, like a health certificate that is delivered by a vet to prove that the animal that was slaughtered was healthy. And I would say that for me, it's normal that you require this from the animal, from where the biopsy was taken. And it's also, I'm looking for words. It's also a matter of fair competition, because at the end of the day, meat and cell-based meat, they look the same, they serve the same purpose. And I don't think from a competition point of view, from a competition law point of view, would be fair to give the advantage to the newly developed one, while the traditional one, we have to suffer more restriction. You have to build a system that doesn't jeopardize the thing that was on the market longer than the new one that just arrived.
That makes a lot of sense. I think in the U.S. there's like Whole Foods was having a tier system. There's either Whole Foods or the FDA. I don't remember where the rule for this was coming from, but basically there's like tiers in terms of like how you treat your animals. Like, are they free range versus like in little tiny cells or something? And so like the better the quality of life for the animal it was, the better your rating. And I don't remember if it goes like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the top percentage of people, they actually don't have enough people that could meet that quota. So then they started like lower, like they would go to like people who were like a tier 4, if it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 5 is the lowest. And then, kind of putting them in the same area as the 1s and 2s. So people thought they were buying these free ranged animals that were having like really healthy, happy lives. But in fact, they're, it's either being mislabeled or they weren't, they were or put in the wrong area, so that people were actually buying things that were not of that quality, if that makes sense. And so I always wonder, like, how do you make that fair? You know, how do you make it so that, like, kind of what you're saying, like, if there are people who are doing the work, have been doing it for a while, and then there's like something new on the market, like, how do you label it or set it up so that someone who can just, who's has a busy life, you know, has kids or just traveling a lot, can just come in and say, like, oh, okay, this is the good stuff, and I know it's good because of these things that, you know, are good systems put in place. So I guess to like tailor that to the question, are there systems that are doing it right, and or alternatively, if you could like dream of the ideal system that would take care of these issues, what would it be?
It depends if the product does require regulatory approval. Like for instance,
Mm-hmm.
for plant-based meat, you don't have to ask the FDA or another authority to assess your product because in general they use ingredients that have been on the market for a long time. And then it's just a matter of respecting what is written in the legal system. So wherever in the world you will have a set of basic legal principles, just such as consumer protection. So you make sure that your advertising doesn't mislead people. So you don't say we are the best or this company is not doing as good as us. Then you have to also respect the fair competition rules, saying that, I mean, naming and shaming is never a good practice because it's going to backfire at the company, because you cannot say we do better than this one and then you don't prove why. And it's also it's not fair game if in order to gain new shares of the market you just try to discredit what the others are doing out there.
Mm-hmm.
um, and yeah, so it's consumer protection and then fair competition. And then lastly, it's what the system allows in general in terms of food safety. The way it's working at the international level, so when a country doesn't have any food standards, they will look at the Codex Alimentarius, so what is written in there. And for food tech, it's a bit complicated at the moment because you don't have data on this. And then like countries, they can decide to have stricter rules than the one required by the codex. So the US has rules that I would say are similar to the codex, wherever the EU decided to go above, but it was not without consequences because it's also impacted the international trade. When you had the novel foods regulation applied to traditional foods, for instance, quinoa or stevia that were consumed in other places, and they were allowed in the US without any kind of check. The EU got a lot of backlash saying that they were putting unnecessary trade barriers for these countries, and it was not fair. But in the end, I think they had to pay a fine, and they decided to carry on with the current
Hmm.
system.
Yeah, it sounds that happens a lot in America, where sometimes um, the good way of thinking about it for most people is in America, like you can get a parking ticket, but if you make enough money, a parking ticket is just the cost of parking your car there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like there's like rules for everybody, and then there's rules for people with money that can just kind of like, oh, okay, so then you just factor in the cost. There was a show called Mr. Robot, I think, where there was a in the show. I don't know if you ever seen this. It's pretty good. But in the show, there was like a chemical spill that gave spoilers for anyone who haven't seen this. I'm sorry, but there was they gave people some cancer, and the daughter of one of those people went to fight the company, and eventually, like they had to fight a lot to get any sense of settlement. And then when they were talking to the guy said, "The day we did this cost saving measure, we put it into a fund to make money, and the fund has made so much more money than what you're going to cost like charge us in terms of settlement,
Mm-hmm.
so we can give you what you want. Like we're still going to make a lot of money off of this, even though like people got cancer and stuff." um I wish it wasn't that way though. That seems, you know, it's not fair to anyone. And is are there better ways other than just I think Finland has like a percentage of, it's like a percentage of your income. So like if you're a high wealth person, you got a speeding ticket, it'll be higher than if you're um you know, not making as much. I don't know how you think
Uh,
about that.
I heard so, but for the food industry, like I'm thinking about when you have a product that has been deemed non-compliant, you may decide to pay the fine instead of doing the whole marketing strategy again. For instance, it's very common in the EU that you get products that try to label, companies that try to label their products as milk, even though it's from a plant-based source. And sometimes they just decide like the fine is like 500 euros, whereas the marketing campaign costed, I don't know, 5 millions. It's for them, it's easier just to pay the fine, wherever like instead of coming up with a new strategy, because in terms of cost, it doesn't make sense to change your tactic.
Is that how you think it should be, or do you think like I imagine it's not good for the consumer if someone can just pay a fine and then not have to do a redo when they're not given that type of approval? Like how would you see it done, or or is it changing to counteract that? Is that like a bad thing? I guess like the first part is that bad? It seems like a bad thing, and then how would you have it changed, or is it changing?
I mean, for my example, like specifically plant-based milk, I don't think it's that concerning because most of the consumers, they will know that nowadays you can drink milk that is from an animal-free source. Whereas if it's something related to the food safety, it's concerning if you can just get away with a fine without, for instance, recalling the product. That's something that I've not heard of. But so I have a master's in food law, and I remember that for one of the model, we were asked whether or not, from a PR point of view, it was better to recall the product. And the answer was no, because the food safety issue wasn't that big of a deal. I think it was in terms of maybe it was for beer, and that the alcohol content was slightly lower than it's supposed to be. Whereas, instead of having the product recall, and consumer, they may have thought that in that case, if you have to recall it, it's not safe anymore. It was not the case. I think it really depends on the product, but food safety crises are not happening as often as some people may assume. And you have system to make sure that if people were injured, they can also be compensated. I don't know if you heard, I think it was mid 2022, Daily Harvest had a case with Tara flour. It was for plant-based frozen meal. Tara is a plant that is mostly used for medicine. And I think the company used it for meal, and it was not checked by the FDA before. And some people had to have some organs removed because of the toxicity shock. So it really depends. Like in that case, I think it was really concerning that this product was on the market in the first place. Whereas if it's just a matter of alcohol content, for instance, for the beer case that I mentioned, it's not really concerning.
Yeah. Yeah, it almost feels like the consumers are the test. Like they put it out there, and it's like, well, we'll see what. It's like we're all like little lab mice, I guess. Like if nothing happens, then it's like, great, we saved money. If not, something bad happens, it's like, oh, we have to make some settlements.
Yeah, and something like legally speaking, I was curious to see how it was actually settled. It's for the COP27. I know that Good Meats, so we make cell-based chicken. Their food was served at a dinner. It was in Egypt, but I just wonder from a safety point of view, did the guest had to sign a waiver in terms of if they have any type of allergic reaction, they would not be able to sue the company. Also, how do you have to, like for the supply chain, like does it have to be frozen, or do you have to take extra precaution when you cook it? I would be very interested in seeing what was written in the terms and conditions just for people to eat this, because it was not mentioned anywhere in the media. And also, I believe it's just not to worry people. And so most of the time in the media regarding to alternative proteins, the emphasis is mostly put on this type of foods. They are going to change the way that we are eating, but they never mention what kind of risk we are taking in introducing them into our diets, because allergenicity, for instance, is not really discussed. And depending on the country, the allergens are not going to be the same. In the US, I think at the moment you have 7 mandatory allergens. So you have to put them in bold or write something extra on the labels. And the last one that is going to be added is sesame. Whereas in Europe, we have about 14. They are mostly from plant origins, like, for instance, nuts, wheat, and over gluten. And I know that I don't know what is the reason. I think you have a lot of people that are allergic to it, but Japan has several meats that are considered as allergen, like chicken or beef, which is not the case in other parts of the world. And I believe that Japan might be a little bit cautious in having cell-based meat introduced in their country, just because they know that people that are already allergic to regular meats may also be allergic to this newly type of meat.
It's interesting. It's another layer to think about if you're in that space, building something or developing something as a scientist or otherwise. It does sound like this is like a battlefield being waged where like consumers, like it'd be hard to stay up to the, like, we're kind of nerdy, so like we get to hear about this, or the guests listening are nerdy people who are very interested in this, but like the consumers, like, to educate the consumer and then have them, you know, fight these battles doesn't seem like they're really a part of it like too much, other than just like, you know, making smart decisions. But I'm curious in that regard, if we think of you as like consumer, how do you go about, you know, I have a friend who worked in like at Taco Bell, and from that experience, they will never eat fast food. Apparently, like, you know, they wouldn't tell me what happened, but they said, like, you don't want to know what happens to your food. But since you're like so aware of everything that goes on, how do you navigate just like getting food and eating when you're traveling? Because I think in one of your interviews, you said, like, they said that you travel like 30 countries or something, which is, it's a little easy when you're in the EU, when it's like a new country is like 10 miles to the left. But how do you just navigate the consumer lifestyle of trying to eat well with all these things that are going on?
So if I just speaking for myself, when I travel, I will do like a quick research about what type of food I can eat, because I have a very specific diet. I was diagnosed with gluten intolerance like 8 years ago. So I'm not celiac, so I can still eat it. But if it's in the meal, I might get tired or things like that. And I have a fully plant-based diet. So if a dish has different variations, like, for instance, dal, and I don't know, for some reason they would also put milk in it, I would just make sure, you know, to learn the words to have a version that is not going to harm me, because I'm also lactose intolerant. And yeah, just the food culture may give you so many answers. Like, people are more adventurous. Like, when you look from the outside, or when you go to a new place and they are eating things that you have never heard before, you are very cautious. Whereas they are, these people, the locals, they may be actually surprised that you are scared to eat that type of products. I'm thinking specifically about insects. It's also part of the alternative proteins, but in the Western world, it's not something that is really consumed. Whereas in Asia or even Africa, that's maybe part of, like, this. It's a sample for people, staple, and they won't be opposed to trying new forms, like cricket flour, for instance. And I feel like education has to be tailored for your audience. You don't teach the same way to kids as that you would do, for instance, to scientists. And this is why it's important to have new sources of food that are checked by someone that is competent to give you an answer. And in terms as well of how do you cook this in a way that doesn't harm you. Like I remember seeing years ago an article about a restaurant in the US making sushi with raw chicken. And I was even surprised that, they were allowed to do this. And
That sounds really dangerous. Yeah.
yeah, like eating raw chicken doesn't sound like a good idea to anyone, I guess.
Yeah, that I don't think if I my wife and I have like this thing with chicken where if like we end up not eating chicken a lot because we'll be like, what is there like a little bit of pink in there? So like we're so scared because we don't want to get get like laid out for like a week. People could die from that type of stuff. Um, yeah, and I was thinking, like one that I've heard of. I've heard of bugs, like everyone's heard of that. I think that's like a really interesting one. But there's one in South America where they eat like guinea pig, or like I think it's like guinea pig they eat. It's like chicken to them.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
up in America, like that's a pet. Like no one
Mhm.
thinks of chickens as pets, even though I had a chicken as a pet growing up. But that's one of those like I don't know if I could eat it,
I wouldn't,
but
but I have a good example. Like I know it's a very cliche food, but I did ate it back in the day when I was a kid. It's frog, and I also
hmm,
ate some snails.
hmm,
And I think I had them both like 7 times in my whole life. And I think most of the time I just gave in it to social pressure
hmm,
because it's part of the culture and it's something that you should try at least once. And I feel like people from other countries, they may be very shocked that people can actually eat that type of food. And I had the same experience when I was living in Vietnam that they explained to me that during the war, they had to be creative about what they could actually eat. And they did find new parts of animals to eat, like, for instance, pig ear. Because when you don't have anything, I mean, when you don't have access to the parts you will normally eat, just have to wait and see if you have other options around you. And it stayed. It's not something that is highly consumed now, but that's something you can definitely find in restaurants or soups with blood, for instance, like
hmm.
in a queue. That's something I've seen in Vietnam as well. Or they have something in the Philippines. It's aborted egg. So half dog,
Oh
half
yeah,
egg. And they say, oh, it's a very good source of protein. It's very tasty. But when I saw it, I was, for me, it was too shocking. And I had no desire to try. And people around me, they were a bit offended because they thought that's something foreigners they had to experience at least once. But I just told them that for me it was too extreme.
yeah. It
And
has eyes.
yeah. And so eating guinea pigs for me, it's not something that I would consider as food. But I do understand that I think it's maybe in Bolivia or in Peru that when you are really high in altitude, that if you don't have other sources of animal protein, this might be widely accessible. And
Hmm.
if you have seen your grandparents eating this, you may just assume that, yeah, why is it weird? It's not.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the war giving like different changes to what people eat. In America during World War II, like we didn't have there's a lot of rationing, and we like apparently they like were tricking people into eating liver more so that they would get the nutrients they need. And it was something that just wasn't being used at the time. Like I think it was mostly thrown away. And now like liver is used for a lot of stuff. So it's really
Mhm.
interesting just to see how like the like rationing or scarcity kind of makes its own thing. Where before World War II, I think eating liver was seen as like, if I remember it right, it was seen as like a cheap thing, like something you wouldn't want to do, like a tacky
Mhm.
thing. And but with like this like education program, they made it seem like, oh, it's really cool, you can do all these different things. And then like all
Mhm.
the people staying home were like, oh, I can make all this cool food, and then it just kept going in the 60s, 70s. And even when I was a kid, like we had liver for stuff, and it's a very strong taste. But it's not the worst thing in the
Mhm.
world. But it's interesting to see like there was something there that people could eat.
Yeah, and also I want to mention as well, like I've heard like recently that lobsters, they were actually a food for
Hmm.
the working class at first, and then
And
somehow
prisoners.
they managed to rebrand it, the whole thing, and it became like sort of a delicacy.
Hmm. There's a story of a guy in Maine that I think was getting his last meal before he was going to be killed for in prison. If I remember this right, once again, it could be one of like one of those stories. But they were going to feed him lobster, and he said, "This is cruel and unusual punishment. I would never eat something so cheap." And he was like mad about it. Like he was being fed lobster. So um, in terms of so there's labeling that people see. Just like I just like touch on some food topics, so we could
Hmm.
just like share stories. Um, the so people can see food labels, but then there's an element of like trusting the system that made the food labels and made it fair, like which is to some extent like we're talking like the U.S. is kind of weird and like maybe you should be a little bit more watchy in terms of like if you're gonna eat
Hmm.
something that's labeled a certain way. There's a I think if I don't know I think this was the case. I don't know if this is the case anymore, but you can have beef that's made in America as like the label, even though it's actually beef that's been shipped up from Argentina and it's undercutting the ranchers in America, which actually like they're very angry about this, but it's labeled as made in America. So we have the
Hmm.
labels that you're supposed to trust, but then the system itself is not something that you should trust. But or there's like things like this where like people are able to like hey, it came in and then it was processed here, so it's still made in America.
Hmm.
How do you I guess how do you like watch the Watchmen? Like, do we like open source the system a little bit more so that people can see like, hey, here's the data and stuff? I don't know if you already can do this. If you just like there's a repository somewhere, it's like this like Impossible Food is bringing out something and you were like looking at their data or something. But like, how do we go about like trusting the people building the systems when there are like these examples of
Hmm.
like you know like what I just said with like the meat packing.
So for me, I know actually where the loopholes are. So
Hmm.
I work with a lot of startups, and sometimes, like from a scientific point of view, their reasoning like does make sense. But from
Hmm.
a legal point of view, I think it's a bit of a risky scenario. And to come back to the meatpacking thing, it's about the country of origin rule. Like either you have, for instance, for meat, like it would be logical that if the animal was born and raised in one place but like slaughtered in another one, that you have the first place as the place of origin. But the thing is, the last step is the most significant one because you have to slaughter the animal. It was done
Hmm.
according to US rules. And so you can put as the place of origin, country of origin, the US. And I've recently seen an example in a French supermarket about Wagyu beef.
Hmm.
I think in Japanese, Wagyu means Japanese, but just a way of preparing this type of beef. And looking at the label, it was actually from Australia.
Hmm.
And it's just the way the system is built. Like you may think as a consumer, if it's country of origin, the animal spent its entire life there. And it doesn't make sense if he was slaughtered in another one, doesn't impact the country of origin as a whole, but the system give you other uh, opportunities as a company to slaughter the animal in the place that has a better reputation.
Hmm.
And I think this is why people are frustrating and they feel that the system is not reliable with just the way it was built. And sometimes it depends as well, like who wrote the regulation. You see that the dairy and the meat industry, they receive a lot of subsidies because most of the MPs were actually from rural backgrounds or they did receive some funds from lobbies or trade association and in turn, they were asked to have a system that is defending this industry's interest, and otherwise they wouldn't be able to get the money.
Hmm.
So, and this is why you have some lobbies that now, specifically for the plant-based sector, they are trying to have rules that are more lenient to the plant-based sector because it's suffering too many restrictions. But the thing is, like in parliaments anywhere in the world, I don't think you have a majority, for instance, of vegetarian. It's very unlikely, but at least they are trying. And I think it depends on how you bring the topic. If you are explaining people the whole spectrum of issue instead of focusing on one that is the hot topic at the moment, people get a better understanding. But I feel most of the debates are driven by emotions. Instead of having sound arguments based on science and logical reasoning.
There's so in the Midwest, if you talk about autonomous cars to certain people, they'll start yelling at you like, "Well, you're not a good driver. You need the autonomous." It's like, that's not the issue. Like, we calm down. Like, you can keep your pickup truck. It's gonna be fine. So for the laws is the movement to incorporate plant-based or alt protein into the existing, like what meat is, like that type of regulatory space? Or do you see the trend more like they're trying to make like a new regulatory system process for that specific type of protein?
So yeah, at the moment, the two scenarios are happening. So the first one, the plant-based products, they try to enter categories that were strictly reserved for animal-based product. And I don't think it's a good solution because you have to change the rules. It's better to have a system that was specifically built for these products because you agree with your partners through trade associations and lobbies what is the most important for your industry, like instead of complying with rules that don't necessarily make sense. Like for me, it would be absurd to have a plant-based meat company having to, for instance, have similar documents as health certificate required for an animal that was slaughtered. Yes, the plant-based meat is going to replace a meat from animal origin, but for me, it's irrelevant whether or not you get this type of document because it's not needed. Plants, they don't need to have like a health certificate telling the manufacturer that soy was slaughtered in the way that is similar to beef. I mean, it's ridiculous. And you see that like if this type of movement is happening for cell-based meat, which is also another alternative protein sources, that they want to have a system that is specifically designed for that type of meat instead of having cell-based meat complying with traditional meat rules, because they are not, at the end of the day, it's the same, like the end product is the same, but the way it was manufactured is totally different. You don't need to have a fermentation process to have a biopsy to make real meat. So we have to be logical at some point that system does reflect what are the advantages and the disadvantages of a certain production method. And if you are just trying so desperately to fit your product into a category that is not suitable for it, that people that are going to be consumers, they are going to be even more confused. And you have inflated claims and over like really poorly designed debate where people, instead of having a conversation where you get to learn about the point of view of the other party, they just keep on arguing on things that don't make any sense. And no one is willing to back down, no one is willing to concede, and no one is willing to listen. And you just hear people running around like a headless chicken.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think you mentioned this earlier in the conversation with this idea that if you have incumbents who are having to change their, potentially their how they get regulatory approved, just for like new incumbents that have an entirely different process, like it's a bit unfair on both people because you have like one that's been specialized over years to work under that system, and then you have a new system being put in there, then they're gonna have to like jump potentially through his hoops. So that's like added money and cost that, like in America, for instance, the dairy industry, they have to like dump a lot of the milk because they're just like too efficient to like keep the cost at a certain level. They have to like do that. That happened a lot in World War II as well. Like they were like burning some of the foodstuffs because they were just overproducing. So like that's a different, like the margins are really low. Like having to like do an extra thing, I think would like cause a lot of people very irritation, a lot of irritation.
Hmm.
So it sounds to me like the better model would be to just have like an entire new uh, system for the new people. So then you could have it really custom to them versus like half applicable to the old people, incumbent industries, and then half to the new. It doesn't work for either of them. It seems like from what what I'm thinking is that like a new one would work best, but I don't know if like maybe that's like
Hmm.
even more of a hurdle to get like a whole new system. I don't know if they like that's even worse than trying to like have half and half in terms of like just like getting it through the law processes.
Yeah, that was very nicely put. And you see the same happening, for instance, for certification bodies that have to certify a factory that is producing a specific type of food, that they will have to come up with ways to check that cell-based meat has food standards that are high enough, similar to the one that are put in place for traditional meat. And it just, I feel as well like I see a lot of funders and other companies that are really eager to change the system. But sometimes I feel that either we want to go to the market as fast as possible, but from a reputation point of view, might not be the best strategy, because if you fail, people they're not going to trust you anymore, and then they're gonna say that if one company is able to cause that type of scandals, like what are the odds that another one is gonna do the same? You have to pause and reflect and have a well thought strategy ahead. Um, so yeah, going to the market first is not the best strategy. You have to make sure that you have run every type of scenarios in your head, just to make sure that you were able to come up with a solution whenever a problem arises.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so we just have to wait and see. And the second thing is like um, you have to be careful not to put your market too early on the market, your product on the market not too early, but you also not have to be constrained and wait until your product is 100% perfect, because perfection doesn't exist. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's just a matter of catering to a specific public that you didn't envision when you decided to create a certain type of food, and just to see what resonates the most with consumers. Like for instance, like for plant-based products, like some companies they want to be the cleanest, the more environmental friendly, and so on. But if you tap into a new ingredient, then it's highly unlikely that enough R&D was invested by other companies in it before. So it's, for instance, people that decide to dish soy as a protein source, because they say it's all type of soy is related to the deforestation of the rainforest, which is not true, because you have soy, for instance, grown in Europe. Uh, and they decide to go for chickpea, but then like chickpea doesn't have the same functional properties. So yeah, you decide not to use soy, but then chickpea is not going to answer all your requirements.
Mm-hmm. The I think my question might be a mild tangent, but I'm curious. We've talked a lot about the regulatory bodies being kind of like a hurdle to be considered. Are
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it's more of a lengthy thing than people realize. Like you're saying, I think in EU you were saying about 3 to 5 years you should think of it, versus in the US, I guess it's like as soon as you find a market for it.
Mm-hmm.
The So people come to you to help navigate that, so that in 3 years' time they don't waste their time. So then, are there is the regulatory environment right now stable enough where like things don't really change over the next 3 to 5 years, so that like you help them once and then they're good to go, or is it like things change a lot and you have to help, like you touch base a lot to like really help them navigate the different things? And then related, are there opportunities with the regulatory bodies going on right now, the regulation going on right now, that startups could use to leverage to do a better job, like to use as a like an opportunity to do well, to have an advantage over other people, if that makes sense. So it's a two-part question, but and maybe I should have just broken up and waited for the second part. But
it just depends. Like I think there is this misconception that legal rules they change all the time, and it's not
Mm.
true because you have to have um, what we call in law it's legal certainty. That is not possible. That you have to expect from companies that they are up and ready every time that the rules are changing. And it also depends, like you have a transition period. If you file in a dossier for approval under a certain law, usually you have to conduct, like authorities, they will keep on doing the analysis according to these rules, uh, regardless whether or not a new law was enforced in the meantime. Because, I mean, otherwise it's a waste of resources, time, money, and so on, just to for the company that invested a lot of time and effort to have a dossier that was compliant with the rules at the time, but also for authorities that have to train their employees to be able to perform a new assessment that is not like the one they were used to. And I feel as well like there is certain markets with an untapped potential, like the Gulf countries, because everything is happening behind closed doors at the moment. Because you do have regulations in place, but sometimes they're not even available in Arabic, and you have to be introduced by other people to authorities and discuss with them what type of information they may need to have the product approved there. So it's not changing as fast as we may expect. And I feel as well that what you see in the media is most of the time the spotlight is put on something very specific that does demonstrate that the product is safe, but they do ignore of everything else that may pose a problem later on.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why you cannot know everything. And I feel like only a small part is disclosed. And you have also to take into consideration that some information they will never be public because they fall under in the category of trade secrets. Like for instance, the Coca-Cola recipe is secret.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that they have to disclose to authorities, and they are keeping it behind closed door because they know that as soon as someone can figure out or release something similar is going to be detrimental to their brand overall. And you have also a lot of technologies used for food tech and alternative proteins that are patented. So it's also another inconvenience I feel for the public that you don't have enough disclosure. But at the same time, as a company, you don't want to invest so much money to have something public in the end because you know that other companies will take advantage of what you have been able to produce for their needs, and you are not going to be compensated. So the system is changing, but it's gonna take some time. And yeah, so I'm more in favor of a system that is the strictest, like the EU. But I also understand the frustration for companies saying that it doesn't support innovation, and this is why they run away to the markets. Like for instance, they run away to Singapore, but Singapore is only 6 million inhabitants, so it's a very small market. And Singapore is part of a broader governmental or intergovernmental organization, which is ASEAN. So the Asian countries from Southeast Asia. But if you have your product approved by Singapore, it doesn't mean that you can sell it in Thailand, for instance. Whereas in Europe, if since the final decision is given by the European Commissions, all the 27 member states, they cannot ban your product because it was assessed at the highest level. So I think it just depends, like what kind of scientific breakthrough we'll notice in the upcoming years, and how these breakthroughs they will be able to reshape the system if needed.
That makes a lot of sense. So if I'm understanding it right, you can't like go to France and get it approved there. and then like you have to like go like top down. You have to go through the EU to France, if that makes sense, to like get something
Yes.
out. Okay.
And if you try to have it approved only in France, like French authorities, they will tell you that you have to apply above, but
Mm.
usually they do it automatically. And for like from an economic point of view, it's also way more advantageous to have the decision taken at the highest level instead of having to go to each and every member state to have it approved.
Yeah, so it sounds like that's a big advantage, the fact that you can go in the EU, even though it's a bit slower in terms of time. It sounds
Mm-hmm.
like a big advantage is like you hit one, you hit, to 27. And I think there's a bunch of new ones being joined. I think Finland and one of the Nordic countries, I think, is enjoying, thinking about joining the EU. So it's like constantly, it seems like it's every now and again it grows a little bit
Yeah.
to Russia's chagrin, but so that's a huge
It's
advantage.
It's so you have the EU and then you have the EFTA, so European Free Trade Agreements
Mm,
Association with Liechtenstein. It's between Austria, and Switzerland. It's a tiny country, about 35,000 inhabitants. Then you have Switzerland and then Norway. Norway is not part of the EU. Maybe they will join, but funny enough, they apply almost word for word the EU regulations.
mm,
And also with this organization, so the EFTA, once you have a novel food approved in EU, they recognize it as suitable for their market, and you don't need to have them assess the product another time. So that's
mm.
something very convenient. You have a lot of hidden tricks, if I may say, that you can find in free trade agreements between countries, and then you realize that oh, this is nice because of the existence of a legal of the existence of a contract. You have the possibility to save time and money.
Yeah, and for the population of that region, like all those different countries, I think it's like 500 million. Like I'm just like on the back of
Almost,
my head,
yeah.
just yeah, okay. So like that's a massive market where if you win one battle, it seems like you win a lot of them.
Mhm.
I mean, America just seems like it's quick and easier, but the EU market, it sounds like, especially if you have someone like yourself who knows how to navigate it, like there's a very interesting opportunity there. Is there are there other ones like that? So you win one, you win a bunch of countries. Are there other advantages to being in that market?
It's the only one so far. I think the other region that may achieve that someday would be ASEAN, but I don't think it's gonna be anytime soon.
Hmm.
And so in North America, I think it's highly unlikely because of language differences, like NAFTA. With like for Canada, you have to have information written both in French and English, and then for Mexico, you have to have them written in Spanish. And
Hmm.
it's in the US, it's just it depends if also for a specific matter, whether the FDA or state authorities are responsible. If the SDA, then you are lucky, and if it's not, then you have to be wary of any modification that you have to be aware of.
Do you typically just for your work do you work with more scientists like startups? Most of the startups I see are usually scientists that are translating something, or are you more in like the like established business helping them navigate like new products?
Both. So I mostly have startups, um, but also worked with VCs, and for them it's very like a business approach. Like, how can you scale this? Like, does it make sense to use this ingredient instead of another one? Where can we maximize our profits and so on. But most I prefer actually to work with scientists, because if there is any type of food safety consideration to address, they will be able to tell me right away. Whereas business people, they are not concerned about the same things, and that's something
Hmm.
that can be overlooked. And funny enough, both in big companies and in small ones, regulatory is always put as the last step, which is a massive mistake because they just assume that as long as they were able to develop a product that satisfy their requirements, they don't see why you shouldn't be allowed, legally speaking. And I would advise companies, whether they are small, medium, or big, to always have regulatory specialists involved at the very beginning of each project because you can work out with several scenarios and just have different point of views that need to be considered in early stages.
Do you how do you like find like ecosystems like a New Harvest or like a Boston like science like PhD science programs? Like how do you go about it? Sounds like a really great advantage you have is that if you get there early enough, you can really change the nature in terms of whether or not they're going to be successful. So then if that's and if they're successful, then people get better food, which is really important. How do you capitalize on that concept? Do you like? I'm just thinking like, you could just like find a bunch of VCs and then talk to them when they're in that stage, but there's like an element of like they're already talking to VCs that are kind of like locked into a system of doing things. Like a lot of people when they a lot of scientists in particular, like they that I know, like they'll talk to a VC and they're afraid to change their way of going about things because then they'll think, oh, I'm signaling to the VC, I don't know what I'm doing. It's like, I don't know. If I was a VC and you changed your mind after what I told you something that's good, or I had an advisor tell you something that's good, like I'd think higher of you versus like you're just a stubborn person. But so how do you get yourself there so that you can help them? If that makes sense.
So I think it's like for me, it's mostly through referrals. Like I worked with one client that knows another one that need help with something very specific. And you see that VCs, like I've seen a couple of them having people from a science background, but it's not always guaranteed. And in that case, it's like a extra indication that a throughout check was made early on. But you see that the beauty in this type of organization, it's that you have people from different educational backgrounds, and they view a topic from different angles, and then you can compromise. And you see when you have companies that, even though they already might have received some funding, the way they talk in interviews or like when you read some stuff about them, that sometimes you can sense that something that was not really addressed because the way they talk about it, either they consider it's really important and it's not, or the other way around, that they consider that something technical is just like a minor detail that can be addressed later on. And this is when I decide to reach out to them, just making sure that they conducted a due diligence process. And most of the time it's not the case. And I think the legal system might be frightening for many of them because I think they would assume that since food law is like it's a legal topic, it's a science, was built on science, it would be logical that you don't have a lot of differences between what is written in the law and how is it working from a science point of view. But it's just not the case, and the law is always lagging behind scientific advancements. And you have to be aware that you need to have a system reform because it was outdated and it only reflects the reality that was happening 5 years or 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and things are really advancing, so it's kind of a detriment at the same time that it isn't rapidly, changing. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's something that you see also in different type of industries, like for instance, like taxes, like financial topics, like cryptos. What type of assets it is for a country in comparison to another one. That's something that is not settled yet. And the more knowledge we have about a certain topic, and the more likely an updated system is going to be replaced, but one that does reflect the needs and the concerns of a specific topic. So it's just like we have to wait and see. It's not possible to plan everything in advance because we just don't know.
That makes
And
sense.
we have to work with what we have and just see if it's suitable, and if it's not, what kind of actions authorities they need to take to better the system as a whole.
So if there's a scientist or someone's going to be working in this area and they want to learn more, like a great resource is, check out your website. But where do you go to stay up to date on these things? Are there books that you read that you think are good for people to check out? Are there websites that you have like either Google Scholar alerts for or something?
I read a lot of scientific articles that does sometimes talk a little bit about regulations. Most of the time they are written by scientists, and I see that the understanding of legal rules is pretty poor. And the thing is, like, as long as you understand how the system works, then, like, for me, I know where to look for. Like, for instance, in the EU, like, when I'm asked about a specific country, what I will do is check first if there is a European regulation on this topic. If not, it means that there is an opening for national regulations. If you have nothing at the national level, then I will go to trade associations or private standards. And it's mostly then about legal cases that took place in the past, or if you want to emulate the strategy from a competitor to see if you have information up there, if they didn't enter any kind of legal hurdles. So I think the simplest advice I would give to people is just check if in their country there is a food safety act or dedicated regulation, and if not, to see if the country in question applies Codex Alimentarius rules. And that's something that you will find on the food safety authorities website, or I don't know, sometime trade for a specific matter. Like, for instance, like for medicine, it's the agency responsible for health that would be the most likely to regulate this. And they have usually a tab with legal instruments that they use. And as consumer, that you can check that some matters that are tackled by authorities or not. But I wished I had a simple answer, but it's just the way the system was structured, whether or not you can get a broad understanding of how you can navigate the system as a company. But it's the same for someone that would like to learn about, I don't know, how the science is working for a specific topic. You get the main areas that are included in this topic. But if you want something very specific, that's something you have to study. And it took me a little bit of time to understand how the system was built. And you have so many loopholes as well. So it's just a matter of being curious. And the funny thing about food law is, like, most of the professionals that apply them, they are not actually lawyers, they are scientists. But it can also be a drawback, because the way you may interpret things as a scientist doesn't guarantee that your interpretation is the one that was adopted by courts or tribunals, for instance. So it's just about being curious and to see, like, what are you interested in, and if you got a certain conclusion, that you check with someone that is able to tell you if your reasoning was good, or if you missed a step, for instance.
Are there cases that, as you're reading through them, like going through this process yourself, that, I don't know, make you laugh or something? So I didn't think law could be funny, but then I was watching this documentary about Pepsi not giving someone a jet and it was all like the case law itself was actually really cool. And I was like, oh, that's funny.
Mhm.
Like if I was just like found that and I saw a judge like make this type of comments, I think it'd be funny because she was trying to define what comedy was as well. So it's like kind of funny given the context. But when you're reading these things, is there ever like something that just I don't know, like takes you back, makes you laugh at all, or like something that like is like, oh, this is kind of a weird way that they would do something?
Yes, I think sometimes, I'm not gonna lie, like legal decisions, they are not really the funniest thing to read. But sometimes you have you have a judge that has like a specific type of humor that may resonate with you, and
Mm,
like sometimes the argumentations of one of the parties like so poorly done that you see how absurd the whole trial is,
mm,
and you can have a good laugh. But in terms of food safety, most of the time it's either related to labeling or like food fraud.
mm,
But you have also like funny decision, for instance, with regard to champagne. I don't know if you know, but there is a champagne producer association that in the food industry, if you include also the beverage industry, is the one that litigate the most. I remember a couple of years ago, they did sue a high luxury brand because they wanted to call a perfume champagne. And then they say, they argue that people that seek out champagne, they seek out something to drink, not to use as a perfume. So,
mm.
yeah, it just depends on what type of goods. Uh, but I feel like with everything happening, it's gonna be yeah, we're gonna have some good laughs. And I've recently saw something, for instance, in Singapore that they wanted to turn urine into beer. I'm not sure where is the appeal to this, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's not allowed yet. So I don't know. Like in terms of food waste or waste in general, it might be appealing to some people, but I don't think it has like a good strategy in terms of scaling up in the future. But yeah, I guess when you think that you have seen everything, there is always something funny happening out there. It's like, okay, some people are actually thinking about this. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm hoping the urine one does not go forward. That sounds weird. That sounds really weird. I know we're coming to the end. Is there what's your ambition for yourself for like 2023, which is like 5 days from now and beyond? Is there like are you working towards something?
So what I'm working on is like I would like to deliver a legal course like on food law and novel food
Oh,
for
great.
non-lawyers. Like I want to make accessible this field that is very daunting, but as soon as you understand the specificities of the topic, it's not that difficult to navigate by yourself. And I've worked with a lot of people, both scientists, business people, and it's always the same questions. So I've been working on this the past month, and I'm hoping to release it maybe Q2 of next year.
Is and this the best way to find it is on your website. Is there like a newsletter you do or anything for people to stay up to date, or like how can people? I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of people that are listening. They're like, oh, that's really cool. I want to check that out. So
So it would be mostly on my website. So it's
okay.
veganfoodlaw.com. But I'm also thinking about maybe launching a newsletter, but
Mm,
I prefer to take it step by step because I do everything by myself and I
yeah.
may onboard people when I feel the need to. But would be mostly like everything that I do would be mostly addressed either on my website or on LinkedIn. Like
Okay.
I also got in touch with you through LinkedIn. So yeah, I think it's a beautiful place to just to get to know what people are doing up there.
Yeah. And your LinkedIn was really nice too, because you're like very like sometimes people are just like, here's my profile, but you're actually like, hey, if when you message me, just let me know what you want to talk about. Like I get a lot of inbound, and sometimes people are just like they just send a connection request. It's like, well, I don't know you. Like, for all I know, you're just trying to get my contact information so you can spam me, or something. I don't know. But so all right, then, is there anything you want to add on that? Sorry.
No, I think it's just like a thought on networking that it's not a one-way street. That if you like to know what someone is doing, you also have to share a little bit about yourself. And that's something that I've started doing a long time ago, and it's actually how I got most of my previous job. It was just getting to know people and just being curious about what they were doing. And the way you approach people will actually impact how they will reply to you, or if they ever reply to you. Just I try to approach things with a open heart.
Mm-hmm.
That if you are willing to get to know people, people are also willing to get to know you, and you are doing an amazing job to showcase new things to people through your podcast. And I thought maybe something like some of your listeners or even yourself, you had some question. And I know that legal learning, like teaching yourself legal things, might not be that exciting, but if you get someone that has been working in that field and is able to tackle the topic in an unconventional way or more practical way, then you can see the value
Mm-hmm.
of what a conversation can bring to people.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. I don't think legal stuff is boring, especially because like I mean it's life and death, you know. Like there was a time where the U.S. didn't have the FDA, and it was like the literal snake oil salesmen. there used to be salesmen who would sell you snake oil. And it would say like, this is gonna give you hair and stuff. Like, so like this stuff is so important. So I really do appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for joining us today with the Learn with Lowell show. Check us out at learnwithlowell.com. Anywhere podcasts can be found. Subscribe. Tell me what you thought of this episode. Check us out on YouTube in particular. That's a new thing I'm doing. Timestamps and links are in the show notes. Thank you for coming, and I hope every one of you found something today that you're curious about to learn more about, and you'll go out and be curious and learn something new. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.